the iconic look versus brand. That's sort of how they work. You know how to do it. What's interesting is the way that something like this, if you use the drawing on paper, really speaks to you about what you do. As I draw over the tops of those records and slowly obliterate them on this lead surface, there's an interesting, first of all, I'm making shapes which are cut off from the actual surface. Eventually it becomes something else which covers the surface, moves in and out of these kind of qualities in different kinds of ways. And he calls it iconic. He thinks of it. And the reason why he thought it was a better idea than anything that you could do in mathematics with either numerals or numbers and brackets is because it was immediate. Looking at it, you can see that one thing is not another, just directly. And of course, the value that Peirce set on the iconic sign is that of immediacy. You either recognize it or you don't. You either recognize in the morning after you've burnt the pan as you cook breakfast that Jesus' head has appeared on the burnt surface of the pan, or you don't. And that's how iconicity works. Iconicity is very important to artists because it's very important that there are people who don't see it and people who do see it. That allows the artwork to have a degree of autonomy. So if I say to you outside, oh look, that cloud up there looks like a dragon, and you look up and you say, no, or you say, it's a tree. That's iconicity, working as it should work. It's beautifully open as an idea. And iconicity is how we, recognition, immediate familiarity with something is one thing that looks like another. First things, everything looks like something else at this point. Interestingly, Peirce had a concept called primary iconicity, which is that one thing will always look more like itself than anything else. So in fact, our ontological engagement with the world has, through Peirce, if you look at it through Peirce's mind, a sort of an inbuilt iconicity. Very interesting. There's another Jesus on an iron. Notice how these things just appear and as you will have known from Lynn's presentation yesterday, there are three signs. The next one is the indexical, the index. And a really famous example of an index is the footprint that appears in the story of Robinson Crusoe. He's on this island on his own, then one day goes down the beach and there's a footprint. And the footprint's on the sand, and he suddenly realises he's not on his own. There are a number of things to say about indices, as they say in plural. The cuts on the blank paper, they're indices, because in fact, an index should happen through some kind of sequence of contact, physical or chains of contact with it. So, make a mark on paper is to make an indexable sign. You're making simultaneously some kind of iconic reference to the resemblance of say, a thing on a surface of paper, a record on a sheet of paper, but you're also making some sort of trace of your activity. An important thing to remember about indexability is that it doesn't necessarily involve thinking in Peirce's any kind of cerebral activity. In fact, Peirce invented the term to refer to the fact a student, while he was standing looking in a different direction, the student poked him in the back and he turned round. And at this point he suddenly realised that there had been some kind of interpretation of this or that which he hadn't even thought about. And that's where he started to think about the index, the index finger over. Another thing to say, so you don't have to think necessarily to generating text signs. In fact, you have to tend them. And if you think about it, Matt Friday, who is the other person on the island who's left the footprint, he didn't think about his footprints as signs. They were signs, and this is always true in index code, they're signs for the person who wants them to be a sign. Yeah. Once the process what he was on his own on the island, suddenly, the footprint then becomes a very, very low-key sign. And then lastly, the symbolical is it just sounds so strange now, but that's what we call it. A symbol, which has a very particular meaning, because it does mean something in which there is a kind of constructed relationship between the sign and the structure. So, writing is definitely a sign. Paper money is definitely a sign in this sense. It has to be disclosed to you in some sense, or you have to be in a situation where you understand what is being referred to. You can't do it through any kind of iconicity or indexicality. You have to do it. You have to do it because you speak language, because you grew up in that space, because you were told by your mother, etc. So, he holds the note, and he does something very complex with it in semiotic terms. And it's like he's not doing what David Ricardo thought we would do with money. He's not saying to the Greek authority, give me this amount in gold. He's doing something completely different. It seems as though one of the ways to think about the kind of semiotic processes that we've just been describing is that they involve a lot of formative action. So he's doing this with this material thing, this piece of paper. It's important that it's money because the sign doesn't work, but it's doing something completely different from what you would do in order to buy cigarettes or whatever. Similarly, Pitt Rivers, he's got here what looks like a pile of stone tools, Stone Age tools that have been dug up. It looks as though at the back he's got a lot of Roman glass, and you can see roughly what he's doing. He's doing what all 19th century taxonomists would do. He's putting like with like, that's a Roman glass. That's a stone tool. You don't quite know what to do with that skull over the side, it's just on its own. There's a sort of inventory process going on where he's sorting One of the things I'd like to propose to you as part of this is that is thinking in a very special kind of way that is not quite like the kind of thinking we do when we write a book, or even when we talk to one another. In fact, it can be done silently, and it involves iconicity in the sense that this looks like this, I've did with this. It involves indexicality because you can see where on things you can see how things are made, you can see how things have changed, and guess what they might be used for. And actually, as you get more and more learned about it, you can begin to guess at what kinds of symbolic structures might have been involved. And of course, there's all kinds of symbolic structures which you're projecting onto it anyway. It's thinking in a very special kind of way. I mean, I'm saying this because I supervise lots of practice-based research, and I like to think of this as good as a thesis. The billiard table, to me, is actually a thesis. Here is somebody doing research, One of the ways it's like research is Douglas Hofstadter's book about Lucas, very interested in computer systems. But he did these experiments with analogy making as a kind of creative process. And it involves sitting at a table, like we're sitting here, and people going, this is like that. this is different from that. He talks about this process by which you can make one thing look like another, the way in which similarity works. And similarity is really interesting. I mean, I urge you all to look at writings of people like Umberto Eco on likeness and similarity. It's very, very complex. It seems so obvious. Iconicity is not straightforward in this sense. A complication that works so beautifully in his sequences of exchanges across the table about similarity and likeness is, at some point, you say this looks like this, then you can say, what's the this of that? And start to generate more complex, second-order levels of similarity. So that's Hofstadter. He sort of brings a whole interesting spin on what Hitler might have been doing on that table. But there's another step, and this brings us around the big room. There's a very nice essay by Roland Barthes called The Plates of the Encyclopedia. It's very popular. It's almost as good, I think, as what he says is Hannah Lucida about postcards. And he talks about Diderot's encyclopedia because he wants to talk about the growth of a particular kind of enlightenment type sensibility and rationalization of the material world. Remember, his book is the empire of science, Everything is in some sense semiotic. But he was just as able to point to areas in which semiosis stops and breaks down, rather like our coffee and tea moment. He talks about Diderot doing something very similar to this, deciding to write, a certain section of the encyclopedia is going to be about manual work. So it goes, this is a wheelwright's workshop, and in terms of the indexes, and these are the kind of things that you can see in that picture. Being very sensitive to the kind of language of the sheet of the paper and the way that it's broken up and used for semiotic purposes. Roland Barthes says a very interesting thing. He says, isn't it strange the page is divided in this kind of a way and what happens? He says, up here, it's like a scene of daily life and everything is caught up in the narratives of life. And down here, everything is sort of separated out and sort of waiting to do something or not part of something. And then he adds to that a wonderful further section where he says, if you look at this, and then look at that, you can see these in use. And so there's a wonderful sort of movement from a kind of, what the hell is that, to, oh yes, it's that, sort of movement up the page. You see, but of course, if you go the other way, something really terrible happens. You move out of the stories of life into a sort of non-compliant sequence of objects. Once they're in this tabletop inventory state where they've all been separated out, and they start to become non-compliant. They stop being the stories that they should be. And that all objects, and perhaps the status of objects, is best defined by the potential not to tell you things, but to always be able to move beyond your capacity to tell stories about them. He thought that was an important part of semiotic processes, that they were intervening, but also you could move out of meaning just as easily. Just depends which way you ride, you move down the page. I keep thinking of Peirce and cutting up the thing, and then thinking about Diderot cutting up or this artist cutting up. So I come back to Alison's sculpture falling apart in front of me. One of the things that I thought afterwards, reflecting on what had happened, was that blankness, I recognised the blankness. I recognised it as the blankness of the studio. And blankness of production and creativity where actually you don't quite know what things are going to become. Allison Studio is full of bits and pieces that are not yet anything, and they have a kind of, what does this mean, type feeling. So in the midst of this exhibition, quite a high-profile exhibition, as soon as it fell apart, it sort of stopped being what she thought it should be, and went back to that stage before it was really understood or properly conceived or whatever. Do you know, it fell apart, and I'm standing there, and the gallery attendant rushes across, picks it up, puts it back, walks on again. And I was thinking, knowing Alison, I was thinking of all the suffering she goes through to arrive at this kind of answer to a sculptural problem. And there's an attendant who just knows how to do it automatically as part of her job. You know. And she said to me, I spend all day doing this. You know, so that's a sculpture into art. But that, for me, has a significant, it reflects back significantly for me on the idea of practice area. So for artists, because there's a tendency to see it about the reception and the making of meaning through the act of exhibition. And I put up an AHRC slide. There was a review in 2007 of practice-led research and its activities commissioned by the AHRC. And I guess it's just here really, here's the sort of areas that it covered within the art and design area, the art school area. And this is what how people undertake research at that time. So they either have exhibitions, design, journal articles, books, conferences, edited books or chapters, and these are the colours. And look at fine art and exhibitions. We clearly think exhibitions are a way of undertaking research. And yet, I'm wondering, what do we mean when we say that? We obviously say we think it makes meaning in the sense of building up all kinds of meanings through the act of interpretation. But actually, I keep pointing out to my PhD students, keep asking them, what does it feel like when the work's not going so well? What does it feel like when actually the piece doesn't work, or the piece falls apart, or whatever we're talking about? I think one of the most interesting things is that moment when Alison's piece fell apart, it was like the intervention of a studio field, or the intervention of the billiard tables before he starts sorting it out, into the display experience, into the exhibiting experience. And of course, it's like going the wrong way. It's like in Diderot's exhibition at it's like understanding that money is just a piece of paper as you hand it over. Just think of how little thinking about that you do as you pass money around. How, as you're writing on this page now, and you have to note, so what are you doing with free paper at this moment? Just think about how that doesn't feel. Just think of all the ways it might feel if your pen starts to read. People's heads, anything. All these things are ways of disrupting activity, and they make all kinds of interesting things happen because of that, which I think are really important to the act of exhibition. Is a research tool, but it's not necessarily a research tool in the conventional sense we're talking about, and its richness is in the way that it makes available these kinds of experiences. And my point is, and this is my conclusion, is that it happens with objects, and museums are interesting because often the object, you know, when you walk into a museum, you see these dismembered objects from somewhere else that you don't understand. That's a very special kind of way of negotiating the material world and what it means. Similarly, as with Julie Rosefeld's installation of films, projected electronic screen material does this in the same way. The material world, the material term, it's very important to understand through these kind of mechanisms. And part of what I'm trying to say is certainly since the end of the 90s, up until the 90s, most of the things that we talked about in relation to semiotics were based on language, and everything was governed by a linguistic term, which really in the early 60s. In the area I work in the museum world, around the end of the 90s, which up until then had been full of interpretive, linguistic analyses of museum collections, of what we call inter-artifactuality, the way that objects, what he was doing on the billiard table, he was quoting ways of assembling objects, which is on a linguistic model of intertextuality, sort of in the Julia Postigo way. Suddenly, we've heard all these museum people starting to say, well, actually, I'm not sure it's appropriate to take the collection of cooking pots and think of some sort of text. People started looking for alternative ways of making meaning through the stuff they handled. And I think that material term, as it's called, is very important to all of us. And it's certainly why we might be here discussing the design and the semantics of form and movement. The rupturing within those processes are a sort of key to making that sequence of words add up to something, because you're referring to, in one manner, you're referring to material consciousness experiences. That's what I'm going to finish. Thank you. No, just a minute. Isn't that beautiful? That says it all. It's a penny from 1902, and the suffragette is stacked over the room. Now imagine spending that money in the early 20th century. That to me is an exquisite object. It's not exquisite because it's a beautiful penny. I think the argument is exquisite because of how it's been formed as a piece of currency.
Well, Chris, thank you. You've certainly turned the semantics, the material, my mind, our tea time on its head. Even that penny is now put down. So it seems right that we should interrogate Chris a bit further on this before we start. Who dares go first?
I saw a little green on the forest.
I'm very ready. You know, something in me tells me this is your eye.